The idea that our moon might be hollow inside, or even that it could be an artificial structure built by someone, sounds insane. It comes across like the plot of a science fiction story. And indeed, as it often happens, this idea first appeared in science fiction. But interestingly, it seems that even some scientists once speculated about this. They were prompted by a number of oddities of our natural satellite. Today, though, the only people who seriously discuss it are conspiracy theorists, pseudoscience enjoyers, and all of those kind of folks. Our moon really gets a lot of wild theories. Some say it's artificial, while others go as far as to claim it doesn't exist at all, that it's just a hologram or a projection of some kind, or that it's actually very small and much closer than we think. The moon's real or perceived oddities just won't let people rest. Were there really actual scientists who wrote about the moon's artificial origin? What real studies, events, measurements, and properties of the moon led people to these conclusions? How is this connected to the human landing on the moon? And what's the irony of this whole story? Today we'll be talking about all this and more. There is a lot of interesting stuff here. I'm Andrei, and this is Cosmos Elementary. One knew that the moon had a lower specific gravity than the Earth. One knew that it had little air and water inside, and one knew that it was a sister planet to the Earth, and that it was unaccountable, that it should be different in composition. The inference that it was hollowed out was as clear as day, and yet one never saw it as a fact. Or here's another one. Down below, caverns beneath caverns, tunnels, structures, ways, it must open out and be greater and wider and more populous as one descends. Assuredly, right down at the last, the central sea that washes around the core of the moon. These are not posts from conspiracy forums. These are excerpts from H.G. Wells' novel The First Man in the Moon, which was published in 1901. This is one of the first, if not the very first mentions of the idea of a hollow moon. But that is of course a work of fiction. But scientists began discussing the possibility of a hollow moon, for example, in the late 1950s. And it wasn't just anyone but the well-known Soviet astronomer and astrophysicist Joseph Shklovsky. But he wasn't writing about the Earth's moon, but about a moon of Mars, namely Phobos. Measurements of Phobos' acceleration at the time indicated that it had a low density. Shklovsky reasoned that the moon might be hollow inside. And not just hollow, but possibly consisting of a fairly thin metal shell, which would mean it could be artificial, or of alien origin, because if someone did build it, it was clearly not humans. But even though we still don't know exactly how Phobos formed, whether it's a captured asteroid or was formed from Mars rings and so on, the idea of an artificial origin is no longer considered today. It turned out that Shklovsky's initial reasoning was based on incorrect calculations of the moon's acceleration. Phobos may still be porous, but any cavities it has are very small. By the way, some people even speculate that our Earth itself could be hollow, but I've already made a video about that. Check it out if you haven't seen it. But what about our moon? This isn't the first time I've talked about the moon's oddities. I have even briefly touched on the idea of its supposed artificial origin, along with one argument that's supposedly in favor of that hypothesis. Nowadays, you can find articles or videos where people try to prove that there's something wrong with the moon, and as a result suggest it might, for example, be an artificial object, created by highly advanced aliens in the distant past, or even by humans who came from the future. Often such articles list a number of strange and unexplained properties of the moon. Some of these arguments arise from ignorance, and some can be explained quite easily. But there are also those in which there really is something, and scientists are trying to figure it out. For example, one of the moon's claimed unusual properties is that its rotation on its axis is synchronized with its orbit around Earth, which is why we always see only one side. In other words, the moon is tidally locked. But as we know very well, there's nothing unusual about this. Almost all planetary moons in the solar system are tidally locked, And even planets located close enough to their stars can be in a tidal lock. Also, conspiracy theories really like the arguments about solar eclipses. People ask, how did it happen that perfect eclipses are possible? Why do the moon and the sun appear to be the same size in the sky? Since the moon is 400 times smaller than the sun in diameter, the sun must be exactly 400 times farther away. If the moon were closer to the sun, this is how it would look. But it's at just the right distance from us to appear the same size in the sky. How could this happen by accident? Well, first of all, these sizes don't match perfectly. The moon isn't always at the same distance from Earth, which is why there are also non-perfect eclipses, the so-called annular eclipses, when the moon is farther away and therefore appears smaller in the sky, creating this ring. Secondly, we know that the moon hasn't always been at the same distance from Earth as it is today. It is gradually moving away, and billions of years ago it was several times closer. So, this remarkable coincidence applies only to a certain period in history, the one in which we are lucky enough to live. The probability that we happen to live during this period is indeed low, but in a vast universe, even incredibly rare events can occur. And to conclude that just because the apparent size matches in our time, someone must have placed the moon there on purpose is a bit over the top. But there are other oddities as well. I mentioned before that the moon is very large relative to its planet. All other known moons are much smaller compared to their planets. The moon's hemispheres are also very different. On the far side of the moon, there are almost no dark volcanic regions called maria, and there are more craters. Gravitational measurements show that the moon's crust on the far side is noticeably thicker than on the near side. On average, it's about 20 kilometers thicker. And the surface composition on the far side is also slightly different. Undoubtedly, all this makes for very intriguing cosmic mysteries. There are theories about how these features can be explained, taking into account the evolution of Earth and the Moon, but so far it's unclear how exactly these arguments are supposed to prove that someone built the Moon. So far it looks like people have gathered a bunch of unusual properties of the Moon, said, "Look how strange it is. Someone must have built it." But these aren't all the arguments. Strange and contradictory ideas and hypotheses often arise from the apparent impossibility of simply going and checking things directly for oneself. Well, we see the moon from afar, but who knows what lies beneath its surface? Just try going and proving that it's not hollow and not artificial. And similar debates arise about the Earth itself, and we actually live on it. And yet, we have ways to get a fairly good idea of the internal structure of a planet or moon without literally digging thousands of kilometers beneath the surface. One word: seismology. Hundreds of seismological stations scattered around the world help us understand the internal structure of our planet. They record signals from earthquakes, and by studying how seismic waves travel through the Earth, their speed, how they refract and reflect, we can fairly accurately reconstruct the planet's internal structure, how many layers it has, the properties of those layers, and so on. Of course, this isn't the only way to obtain information about the internal structure, but it's probably the main one. So why not apply it not only to Earth, but also to other bodies in the solar system? For this method to work, we need two main elements: some events that generate waves through the planet's or moon's interior. On Earth, these are mainly earthquakes, and of course, seismological stations to record these waves. So we need to send seismometers to the moon and analyze their measurements. The truth is, before seismic studies of the moon began, we didn't even know if there were moonquakes. After all, there are no tectonic plates or active geology there. Could it be completely geologically dead? And yet the Apollo mission included seismometers in their sets of experiments to be conducted on the lunar surface. Here's one in the foreground. Their purpose was to find out whether moonquakes exist, what types they are, and of course to study the moon's internal structure. By the way, in case there were no natural moonquakes, the seismometers on some missions would still have detected certain signals. Because after finishing their stay on the surface before heading home, the astronauts of Apollo 12 mission hit the moon's surface with the lunar module to create the first ever man-made moonquake. But the Apollo mission seismometers recorded not only that event, they also detected quite a few other moonquakes of natural origin. The nature of the seismic waves recorded by the seismometers differed, indicating their different origins, and moonquakes were classified into 4 types. Deep moonquakes, their epicenters are located deep, at around 700 kilometers beneath the surface, and they are most likely caused by tidal forces. It's not only that the moon that causes tides in the Earth's oceans, it also affects the solid surface, though this is less noticeable. Likewise, Earth deforms the moon, which causes moonquakes. Shallow or tectonic moonquakes occur at depths ranging from a few tens to about 200 kilometers. They are caused by the moon and its core gradually cooling, which literally makes the moon shrink. This leads to deformations in the rock and triggers moonquakes. Thermal moonquakes are related to the fact that the same area of the slowly rotating moon is exposed to the sun for about 2 weeks, heating up to high temperatures, and then falls into shadow and cools. The temperature difference is huge, and this also causes shaking. It's like an ice cube cracking in hot tea. And the last type, meteoroid moonquakes, when celestial bodies strike the moon's surface. That also causes some shaking. Speculations that the moon might be hollow are fueled in large part by the fact that moonquakes are quite different from earthquakes. The artificial moonquake of Apollo 12 caused a particular stir. The advantage of this experiment over signals from natural moonquakes was that the exact time and location of the impact were known, and it was clear from where the waves spread across the moon. When the astronauts launched from the moon in the ascent stage, they docked with the command module, transferred into it, and then the ascent stage was detached and sent back toward the moon. Traveling at a speed of 6,000 kilometers per hour, or about 3,700 miles per hour, it crashed into the moon's surface, 76 kilometers or 47 miles from a seismometer, and the impact energy was equivalent to the explosion of 1 ton of TNT, creating an artificial moonquake. The wave pattern most closely resembled that of a shallow tectonic moonquake, but overall the data obtained from this experiment surprised scientists. What surprised them? Try to guess yourself. Here is a signal from that very event. And here is a signal from a man-made earthquake on Earth, the signal from a powerful dynamite explosion recorded by an Earth seismometer. Do you see the difference? And I'm not even talking about the nature of the signal itself and the fact that on Earth you can distinguish P and S waves. What concerns us right now is the difference in time. The signal on Earth lasted tens of seconds. Here, however, the scale is in minutes. It took 8 minutes just to reach maximum amplitude, after which the weakening signal was recorded for almost an entire hour. And this is generally characteristic of moonquakes. If shaking on Earth lasts at most a few minutes, on the moon it lasts tens and tens of minutes. When describing the experiment's results, NASA used the phrase, "The moon rang like a bell." The public saw this in the 1970 issue of Popular Science, and here's the exact quote. Of course, it wasn't meant literally. It was an analogy to show that after the impact, the seismic waves did not die out for a long time, similar to the vibrations of a bell or a tuning fork. Scientists immediately came up with explanations for this unexpected behavior of the moon, and one important factor was the moon's relatively low density. But when conspiracy theorists saw this, especially the bell quote, they interpreted it almost literally. Coupled with the moon's low density, they concluded that the moon must be hollow. Today we know that one of the main reasons moonquakes differ so much from earthquakes is the fact how dry the moon is. There, as far as we know, there is no liquid water. On Earth, liquid water affects rocks and minerals, altering their structure. They become somewhat softer and dampen vibrations more quickly. So water not only gives us life, but also protects us from even greater destruction. Thanks to it, even the most powerful earthquakes last only a few minutes. Imagine the devastation if earthquakes lasted an hour and a half. Interestingly, conspiracy theorists love to spread the story of a hollow moon. You can find them on all sorts of forums and videos, or on sites like Gaia.com. And ironically, on these same forums, websites and channels, People sometimes deny the reality of humans landing on the moon. Yet, those same people use arguments in favor of a hollow moon taken from the research conducted by humans on the moon. So, did they go or not? Conspiracy theorists love using scientific arguments when it suits them, and then, in the next sentence, claim that scientists are lying. But here, in my opinion, the hypocrisy reaches a whole new level. But here we have real data, but the incorrect conclusions drawn from it weren't made by scientists. But I did mention that scientists also wrote about hollow and even artificial moons, so let's talk about it now. The hypothesis that the moon might be artificial, possibly a gigantic alien spacecraft, is also known as the Vassen-Shcherbakov hypothesis, or theory. In 1970, two Soviet scientists, members of the USSR Academy of Science, Mikhail Vassen and Alexander Shcherbakov, wrote an article. In it, they speculated that the moon could be the creation of a highly advanced civilization. They presented several arguments in favor of this hypothesis. To be fair, some of the questions they raised at the time didn't have yet more satisfactory answers. For example, they wrote that, at the time, there was no solid theory for the moon's formation. They listed the hypotheses that existed back then. They wrote that the hypothesis in which the moon is a piece torn off from the Earth is rejected by the evidence, though they don't elaborate further on this point. Next, they reject the hypothesis in which the Earth and Moon formed independently but within the same cloud of gas and dust, based on the fact that the average densities of the Earth and Moon differ significantly. The average density of Earth is 5.51 grams per centimeter cubed, while the Moon's is 3.33 grams per centimeter cubed. They argue that if they had formed from the same cloud of material, their density should be the same. Third hypothesis is that the Moon formed independently, perhaps even beyond the solar system, and was later captured by Earth's gravity. This could explain the different properties, but they call such an event practically impossible. And since they considered all three existing explanations unsatisfactory, they proposed their own. The Moon is an artificial object placed in orbit around Earth by some highly advanced civilization. The authors didn't speculate on who they might have been. One of the main arguments is its low density, which the authors believed could also hint that the Moon has a hollow interior. Did you notice something missing from the list of hypotheses? The modern hypothesis of the Moon's formation, the giant impact hypothesis, according to which a Mars-sized protoplanet named Gaia collided with the proto-Earth, ejecting debris into space from which the Moon eventually formed. This hypothesis perfectly explains one of the main arguments, the Moon's low density. When the two planets collided, Gaia's heavier iron core was mostly absorbed by Earth and merged with our core, and the material ejected into orbit was mostly the less dense mantle material, which is why the Moon ended up being less dense. Although similar ideas had been proposed earlier, the more or less modern form of the giant impact hypothesis appeared only several years after Vassen and Shcherbakov's article. Many of the data and high-precision computer models supporting the hypothesis appeared even later. But these aren't all the arguments presented in the article. If the Moon was built somewhere far away and later brought here, it could be older than the Earth. And supposedly this is supported by the fact that the dating of lunar samples shows that they are older than Earth's rocks. But it's actually quite straightforward. On Earth, it's very difficult to find rock fragments that have remained unchanged since shortly after the planet's formation. On Earth we have the movement of tectonic plates, which recycles rock, as well as volcanism, erosion, wind, water, and so on. For the same reasons, there are very few impact craters on Earth's surface, but on the much less geologically active Moon with almost no atmosphere, no volcanism, and no weather, rocks remain largely unchanged. That's why we find much older rocks there. Another argument still actively used by conspiracy theorists trying to prove that something is wrong with the Moon is the question of why all the craters on the Moon are the same depth. I've already addressed this question in a separate video, To recap briefly, first of all, they aren't all the same depth. Small craters can be just a few meters deep, while larger ones are several kilometers or miles deep. A more accurate question would be why, as crater diameter increases, their depth doesn't increase proportionally. Small craters are shaped like bowls, while large ones are more like shallow plates. Here, the authors of this article conclude that apparently a protective metal shell lies a few kilometers beneath the loose surface layer, which even large asteroids cannot penetrate. Although it's possible that particularly massive impacts could still damage the shell. They cite a feature of the lunar landscape known as the straight wall as an example. They claim it's unusually straight and suggest it might be the edge of an armor plate forming the moon's metal shell, exposed after a powerful asteroid impact. In reality, it's not a wall, but a so-called linear fault. The appearance of a tall wall is created at certain times by sunlight and the shadow it casts. As for it being so straight, first, this feature isn't really that straight to resemble the edge of an artificial metal sheet. And second, nature produces plenty of long and relatively straight formations on mother bodies as well. Here's an example from Mars. And also, some areas on the surface were supposedly repaired by alien inhabitants of the moon at some point. By now, they're most likely no longer there, they either died out or left. The dark areas called lunar maria are supposedly regions where the top layer above the metal shell was damaged, and the moon's inhabitants, or automated systems, cemented these areas with material from the moon's interior. That's why we see the darker, smoother plains. In reality, these are basaltic plains most likely formed from solidified lava. As for crater depth, there is nothing strange about large craters being shallow. On the contrary, it would be unusual if the moon had gigantic pits tens of kilometers deep. And there are at least two reasons for this. Collisions that form craters hundreds of kilometers in diameter are incredibly powerful events, releasing so much energy that the solid rock heats up and begins to behave like a liquid. Modern computer simulations demonstrate this perfectly. Such an event does not leave behind a gigantic pit. Besides, gravity prevents it, as it tends to shape all sufficiently massive bodies into a form as close to a sphere as possible. A depression of a few percent of a celestial body's radius would be simply unstable and would quickly collapse. It's still interesting how more than 50 years later, these arguments, especially about the craters, continue to be repeated in comments, articles, and videos. But as I've already mentioned, back then there weren't many of the tools and information we have today. Plus, there is another small nuance here. Although this article was written by scientists, it wasn't published in a scientific journal, but in Sputnik magazine, sort of a digest. Such an article wouldn't have passed peer review in a scientific journal. And the authors themselves state at the beginning that the idea is quite speculative. There are even entire books about the artificial moon hypothesis. However, these were written long after by authors who aren't scientists. Most of them repeat many of the arguments we've already covered today. They also cite as evidence various flashes seen by astronauts near the moon, or claims that people in space regularly see UFOs, but that's a whole separate story. At the end of the article, Vassan and Sherbakov wrote that future evidence could either confirm or refute their hypothesis. Well, it was refuted. A large amount of seismological data and gravitational measurements have allowed us to form a picture of the moon's internal structure. And of course, it's neither artificial nor hollow. Its structure is very expected: crust, mantle, core. And the core is relatively small compared to other rocky bodies, which partially explains its lower density. And ultimately, just like with the hollow Earth idea, such a gigantic hollow structure shouldn't exist. It would collapse under gravity, unless it were made of some unknown material, but layering speculation upon speculation. It's still fascinating how the lack of data in the past led even scientists to speculate and come up with such extraordinary ideas. But it's amusing that some people still repeat old arguments that have been already thoroughly explained. Thanks for watching. Links to all of the sources are, as always, down below in the description. And if you enjoyed the video, leave a like, comment, and subscribe for more videos in the future. Bye.